Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about spiritual narcissism. Before we get into it, I do want to mention this is not an official subtype of narcissistic personality disorder. There's actually quite limited research on the link between narcissism and spirituality, but a spiritual narcissist has been sort of unofficially defined as someone who uses spirituality to feed their ego and to exploit others. So in today's video, I'm going to share some of the characteristics of spiritual narcissists according to what little research there is available on this. Let's get started. So what are some of the characteristics of spiritual narcissists? The first one is that they feel superior to others due to a sense of spiritual enlightenment. They position themselves as sort of spiritual leaders in order to derive admiration or a sense of superiority and validation. Sometimes they might claim they have special access to divine information, like God talking through them, telling them what other people need to do, or special paranormal abilities, what's called in the literature supernatural overconfidence. Like they literally think they're superhuman. They think they are more special than every other human on this planet. And because they feel superior to those they deem to be less enlightened, what that also means is they tend to be quite close-minded to other schools of thought, which results in this dogmatism. They tend to build a spiritual culture that's devoid of debate or humor and to eliminate critics, so that it's only their enlightened divine voice that other people are listening to. Another characteristic of spiritual narcissists is that their self-worth is contingent on their spiritual accomplishments. Now, typically the point of spirituality is to transcend the self, to transcend the ego, to feel at one with the entire universe. But for narcissists, this kind of backfires, and spirituality becomes actually a way of strengthening the ego. It's not about how they're at one with the world or about accepting themselves in their totality as imperfect, but rather about placing themselves at the top of a hierarchy. They're not actually more enlightened in the sense that they are able to transcend their selfish needs. They think there's a hierarchy of enlightenment and they're at the top of it. In a sense, they're not at all quieting the ego. Another characteristic is that spiritual narcissists derive their self-worth from their ability to heal or help others, which sounds good on the surface. It can sound a little bit more like communal narcissism, where a person derives their self-worth from being able to help the community, to help the collective. And actually, spiritual narcissism and communal narcissism tend to be quite correlated. But although it's obviously great to help people, if you're doing it because that's what you need in order to feel worthy rather than because you actually care about people and have empathy for them, then that means that you have extrinsic motivations underlying your spiritual behaviors rather than intrinsic ones. In other words, you're not really internally spiritual. You're doing spiritual things and helping other people because it makes you feel better as a person. Another characteristic is spiritual bypassing, which is when you avoid the darker side of psychology through spirituality, whether it means, kind of brushing your traumas under the rug, or avoiding accountability, or avoiding painful emotions. Spiritual narcissists tend to try to bypass those darker sides of psychology. A big example is toxic positivity. They will sometimes call certain emotions that are more painful, like low vibration, claim that anybody who has a criticism of them is just not enlightened enough. They also tend to have a very performative, false sense of humility. For example, they might call themselves God's servant or God's humble servant, but really what they're saying is God is speaking through me, and therefore when I say something, that's really God and you have to listen to what God is saying. In reality, what they're doing is projecting their own desires and motivations onto a God figure. They're misattributing their own thoughts and feelings to the divine. And this false sense of humility really shows that they display a persona that is the complete opposite of their true self, which is rather grandiose. They portray themselves as being very humble, but in reality, they think very, very highly of themselves. They're not humble at all if you read between the lines of what they're saying. And another characteristic is that spiritual narcissists weaponize spirituality against those who don't obey. They often take part in a defense mechanism called splitting, which creates the sort of in-group, out-group dynamic. In-group people who agree with them are all good, and the out-group people who maybe have some criticisms of what they say are all bad. Any critics are just low vibe. And because they have this very intense schism in how they see people, anyone who isn't 100% validating them is at risk of receiving a sense of paranoia from them. They're they're afraid of dissent, they're afraid of abandonment, and because of that, they're constantly sort of hypervigilant and on the lookout for people disobeying them. And this results in also a lot of manipulation and control. This is actually how cult leaders isolate cult members from outsiders. They encourage them to cut off all of their family, all of their support systems, certainly anyone who is critical of the cult leader, and then often they guilt them into loyalty or obedience by emotional blackmail. A reason why spiritual narcissists are so exploitative is because, as part of narcissism, there is a lack of empathy, a deficit in empathy. So they can easily justify when they exploit or hurt others. In their heads, they can kind of rewrite what happened to frame themselves still as some sort of messiah. Narcissists tend to feel less guilt because they tend to rationalize, distort, and reinterpret the facts of what happened in a self-serving way, which means that they're more likely to lash out at others than to actually look inward for strength and accountability for themselves. And so spiritual narcissists can be quite controlling, which is ironic because a lot of spirituality in many faiths is releasing control, sort of practicing acceptance and non-attachment to outcomes. But spiritual narcissists, ironically, are very, very controlling, particularly with other people, but also with their own experiences and emotions and everything. So all in all, spiritual narcissists portray themselves as being something that they're not. They act religious or spiritual when internally they lack what actually makes a person spiritual. Ego death, releasing control, empathy for others, a sense of oneness with other people. They portray themselves as being humble when actually they're quite grandiose. They portray themselves as helping the collective when really they're pursuing selfish self-interests. They portray themselves as kind while manipulating, controlling, and exploiting other people. Side note, if you've ever experienced spiritual narcissism, whether it's, in your religious organization or ever dated one, ever known one as a friend, I'd be really curious to hear about that because I personally have not encountered one that I know of. So I'm really interested what your lived experiences have been. So pop that in the comments down below. Now let's talk a little bit more in depth about what the research says about spiritual narcissists. Contrary to popular opinion, religiosity is not decreasing because of increasing rates of narcissism. That is a common thing that people say, is that, people are becoming less and less religious because they're becoming more and more narcissistic and selfish. Research shows that grandiose narcissists tend to actually be less internally spiritual. Like I mentioned, they are less humble, forgiving, apologetic, empathetic, and yet they report similar levels of religiosity as the general population. In other words, they seem just as religious as the average person externally, but they're less so internally. And despite the stereotypes, atheists and non-religious people tend to be lower in grandiose narcissism. Does this mean that religious people are more narcissistic? No, I think it means a subset of narcissists turn to religion or spirituality because it can be easily weaponized, because it can be a tool of control. Another interesting finding from the research is that spiritual training, such as teaching people how to meditate or even yoga, may paradoxically induce feelings of superiority for those who are prone to narcissism. Because spiritual narcissists tend to have their self-worth be contingent on sort of spiritual accomplishments that they have, feeling enlightened. So when they take part in more spiritual behaviors or they're trained into spiritual practices, that flares up. They tend to feel more superior. Now, at the same time, grandiose narcissists are also less positively affected by certain spiritual practices like meditation. So they might be getting less out of it in terms of actual spiritual benefits, and yet they're feeling more superior because of it. Narcissists also may report feeling angry with God due to a sense of entitlement that, they should have had certain things handed to them over the course of their life. They also tend to have more self-serving spiritual beliefs. And this is interesting. They also tend to avoid prayer after a transgression that makes them feel guilty. Because remember, they are less prone to feeling guilty. They're better at sort of rewriting what happened. But this next part might actually be the most important part of this video. Spiritually narcissistic leaders require a narcissistic flock to support them. So it's not enough to just say, oh my God, spiritual narcissists are so terrible. You have to look inward if you are a part of the community and assess, why is this person risen to power? It's the same concept as why narcissistic leaders tend to rise to power during times of turmoil and poverty in certain countries. The people are trying to compensate for their own lack of self-esteem through a narcissistic leader's grandiosity. They're sort of idealizing this narcissistic leader because they feel so devalued themselves. This is actually why Carl Jung referred to Hitler as Germany's shadow. In his mind, Hitler had risen to power because Germany had this very dark shadow that was just festering and festering that they needed to project to compensate for the ways in which they felt inferior. This is also why people tend to turn to tribalism and narcissistic nationalism during times of poverty and struggle. Like even right now, all over the world, a lot of peoples are starting to get very narcissistic in the way they express their nationalism. Because when you're doing well as a country, you don't need to prove to yourself, to convince yourself that you're superior to other countries. But when you know you're not doing well, when you and the people around you are really struggling, that's when you need the most to derive a sense of self-worth, to be like, what is our worth as a people, as a country, as an individual? The easiest way to restore a sense of equilibrium is to just elect a super narcissistic, exploitative, powerful leader that makes you feel a little bit better about yourself. So that's, I think, the most important piece of this. The biggest takeaway is that it's our own vulnerable narcissism that brings grandiose narcissists into power. Vulnerability and grandiosity are two sides of the same coin. They're words that are sometimes used to describe narcissism. A vulnerable narcissist is someone who feels that they really suck. They really lack self-worth, and that is also what they express outwardly. A grandiose narcissist expresses outwardly that they're the best person in the world, the highest on the totem pole. And so a population who is quite vulnerable in their narcissism is oftentimes going to elect a very grandiose narcissist as their leader. And I think that does tie into spiritual narcissism as well, because when a spiritual narcissist comes to power in a certain religious organization or in a cult, it's often because there is some level of vulnerability also in the flock that's supporting them. Let me know what you thought of this video. Hope you take care, and I'll see you soon.
Tell me what you mean, tell me what you mean, tell me.